Good afternoon. My name is John Carlton, and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. Thank you all for coming. And well, here we are, the last lecture of the regularly occurring Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series that began in October of 2023, and which was always meant to lead to this moment 37 lectures later, highlighting Frankfort and Franklin County history in the context of America 250. I first want to give a sincere and major thank you to my co-organizer, Diane Dehoney, for her devotion to this series and for all of her tireless work in helping bring this series and the exceptional speakers and topics to Frankfort. And to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us, funding us, creating our publicity materials and graphic design, and for advertising the lectures on Facebook, its website, and its newsletters. And a huge thank you to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping every single lecture and making them accessible to everyone via their YouTube channel. And thank you to the State Journal for always publishing our schedule and helping with additional publicity. A giant thank you to the speakers who have graciously given their time, expertise, and unique perspectives in forming a modern retelling of Frankfort, Franklin County, Kentucky, and United States history. And most importantly, thank you to the public who have attended, some religiously, and shown your support for the series. And another big thank you to all of the local organizations that have financially contributed to bringing some of the amazing speakers we've been lucky to have. America 250 has been a great time for reflection, a time to be thankful for the principles and values of our nation and government, a time to celebrate our many achievements, but also a time to acknowledge where our experiment has failed, has flaws, or could improve. Therefore, America 250 is also a time to look forward, to renew our devotion to the experiment, and to ensure it lives up to the ideals that were put in writing, both in the Declaration of Independence and in our second federal Constitution. At the time of the writing of the Declaration, the framers had learned firsthand what it was like to live under a tyrannical government, from unrelenting taxation to living under British martial law. Over the next 10 years, they learned what it was like to fight the greatest military the world had yet known, and yet they were also learning the costs of operating a weak government under the Articles of Confederation and Continental Congress. It is this constant tug of war between a strong and weak government that has shaped the United States over the last 250 years, and that struggle has existed in many forms. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Plutarch wrote in his Parallel Lives, contrasting in pairs biographies of different people, juxtaposing a Greek beside a Roman, on the conviction that character shows itself most clearly in contrast. You don't fully understand a person until you set him aside, another person, and ask what each one chose to do with his or her life. This series has tried to do the same. First, we opened in October of 2023 with a traitor, General James Wilkinson, Frankfort's founder and the highest-ranking federal officer ever tried for treason and espionage. That lecture was named for the book American Traitor, written by our first series speaker, Howard Cox, a retired senior officer of the CIA, a former federal prosecutor, and a trial attorney in the Army's JAG Corps, who gave a 40-year career to holding the powerful to account. General Wilkinson had laid out the streets of Frankfort in 1786, afterwards rising to become the commanding general of the United States Army, betraying the young republic the entire while as a paid agent of the Spanish crown, known in ciphered dispatches only as Agent 13. He was the most powerful American to ever slip the kind of accounting Mr. Cox spent his life pursuing. Sadly, Mr. Cox passed away last summer. Today, we close with the other half of the pair in full contrast. If Wilkinson was the gifted man who served only himself, today's subject is the gifted man who came in time to serve the whole promise of the Republic. John Marshall Harlan is revered by conservatives and liberals alike, praised as an originalist by conservatives and praised by liberals as an early leader of the civil and human rights era. He practiced law in this city, served as a judge in the Franklin County Courthouse, and was elected Attorney General of Kentucky, holding that office in our old state capital, before he went on to the Supreme Court and into history as the Great Dissenter. He was, by any honest reckoning, an imperfect man, but one that came to see farther than every one of his contemporaries, and whose jurisprudence bent the law toward justice long before the nation would realize the impact of his ideas. It was always the design of this series to arrive here at the 250th year of American independence. So in that light, this pairing means more than virtue set against vice. The revolution was itself an act of dissent. The founders rebelled against a crown to keep rights they held inalienable, and staked the whole experiment on a promise they could not yet honor in practice, a declaration of what this nation was for, written down long before the nation could live up to it. That distance between the promise and practice is not the country's hypocrisy, it is the country's unfinished work, left to everyone who would later hold America to its own word. American historian John Meacham said in his recent book, American Struggle, that, quote, America has always been defined by the perennial struggle between the appetites of the few and privileged and the aspirations of the many who have rightly insisted that the nation live up to its self-professed creed of sacred rights and equal justice under law. So set these two men against that. The British Crown, after all, would have called our nation's founders traitors exactly as we call Wilkinson one today, because both the founders and Wilkinson defied their government. But the difference was never mere disobedience. It was the ideals they chose to stay loyal to instead. The founders broke with a king in the name of a higher allegiance, to rights they held inalienable, to a more perfect union they could name before they could build it. Wilkinson, however, broke with the young republic in the name of no one but himself and tried to sell the great experiment for Spanish silver before it could prove what it might become. Harlan, dissenting alone for a constitution he insisted was colorblind, was doing the founders' own work, holding the republic to a promise it had not yet kept. One man tried to cash the promise out while the ink was still wet. The other spent his life trying to make the promise real. That is certainly the truest way to mark 250 years, not by asking whether the founders were saints or scoundrels, but by remembering that America was built as a promise of things to come, kept only ever by those with the courage to keep advocating and, when necessary, dissenting on its behalf. Our speaker's book, The Great Dissenter, is the definitive life of John Marshall Harlan, and of Robert Harlan, a man born into slavery and raised with the Harlan household, presumed to be the justice's half-brother who rose to become a prominent black political leader in his own right. It is a Frankfort story, a Kentucky story, and an American story. And so without further ado, please welcome Adult Services Manager Diane Dehoney to introduce today's speaker.
John, you took my intro. Thank you so much, John. I just want to say really quick, a big thank you to you. Thank you for thinking of us when you had this idea to bring the Heritage Series here to Frankfort, to include the library, to trust me to help bring your vision to life. It has been a privilege and a joy, and I can't thank you enough. For all of you, I also thank you for always being here and staying with us. Don't go far. I hope you'll stick with us. The series will continue. We're going to continue on with in the spirit of what John and I were able to create. With just a few little things different here and there. We're bringing a new partner on with the Capital City Museum, so stay tuned. There's more to come. So also we have 2 flyers back there that will talk a little bit more about those events that are coming up after Mr. Canellos speaks today. So thank you so much. Also want to say a quick thank you to Liz Taylor from Poor Richard's Books, who's here as our bookseller for the event today. She has copies of The Great Dissenter if you'd like to pick one up and have that signed. We'll have Q&A after the presentation, and then also some time to have a book signing. So thank you so much. It is my great honor today to introduce Peter S. Canellos. He is managing editor for Enterprise at POLITICO and the author of The Great Dissenter, The Story of John Marshall Harlan, America's Judicial Hero, which Publishers Weekly named one of the 20 best nonfiction books of 2021. He is an award-winning journalist who served as an editorial page editor of the Boston Globe and executive editor of POLITICO. In 2023, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won the George Polk Award for Journalistic Excellence. Please help me to welcome to the podium and to Frankfort, Peter S. Canellos.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you, John, also for the wonderful introductory remarks and for shepherding such a wonderful program. It's been an honor for me to meet and to speak to many proud Kentuckians about Justice John Marshall Harlan, who, in my humble opinion, is really among the greatest of figures to come out of this part of the country, and also emblematic of the values of this part of the country. I think there are very few examples of how personal experiences that are rooted in a very unique situation, I'm talking about Kentucky during the Civil War and immediately before and immediately after the Civil War, a really unique situation, then has great influence on the course of the United States. Now, people ask, why John Marshall Harlan? Why do we think John Marshall Harlan's so great? You know, a lot of people have served for a long time on the U.S. Supreme Court. What I would say is that during his 34-year tenure, which was from 1877 until 1911, we now have the benefit of hindsight in being able to judge it. It's been enough time. We can see who was right, who was wrong, how the different disputes played out, which people showed good judgment, which people showed bad judgment. When we think of those years, again, 1877 until 1911, two big things pop out. One is it was the start of the segregation era. It was a time when the country had just fought a civil war, had changed the Constitution, had made strong movements towards equality, and then sharply backed off. And the other big takeaway from that era is it was the start of the Gilded Age, and pretty much the entirety of the Gilded Age, and a time of historic inequality, greatly outstripping even our current era, but a time when, you know, people were building mansions based on those of French kings that we can now visit up in the Hudson Valley and Newport and places like that. While other people, immigrants, for example, are living 8 and 10 to a room, even though all the adults are working, they just couldn't earn enough money to be able to live any better. Those two extreme situations would influence American life for 100 years, right? Those are things that happened during that period. So we can now look back and say, well, who was responsible, who, you know, played what role in creating or trying to ameliorate those problems? And when you look back in that era, you'll say, well, it's not really the responsibility of the presidents during that era. There were a lot of them, a lot of short-term presidents and things like that, but no one ever ran on a platform of creating segregation, reinforcing segregation, or creating income inequality in a fundamental way. It just didn't happen during that era from the presidents. Also, when you look at Congress, there was a lot of frustration with Congress then, just like there is today, and Congress was very slow moving. But at very key and important moments, Congress did step up. So, for example, in 1875, Congress passed a sweeping Civil Rights Act that guaranteed all Americans, regardless of race, of certain access to fundamentals of life, like transportation, public spaces, et cetera, equal access. But the U.S. Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in the cases of 1883, the civil rights cases of 1883, a very landmark, important moment. Voting rights guaranteed by the 15th Amendment. The state of Alabama passed a constitution that grandfathered in all Confederate veterans, said they all get voting rights. Everybody else, which included all black residents of Alabama and a bunch of poor whites, were subject to the judgment of the poll taker as to whether they were people of proper repute and could be rejected at the polls. Booker T. Washington got together a large group of men, 5,000 men, who had paid all the poll taxes, passed all the education tests, had voted in the past, and tried to bring an action before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declared that it was a political question and they couldn't do anything about it. Later on, in the famous case of Plessy v. Ferguson, the state of Louisiana passed what was called the Separate Car Act, forcing black people and white people to be in separate cars on railroad cars. The Supreme Court, as we know, stepped in and then endorsed, gave it official constitutional imprimatur to segregation in that case. On the case of income inequality, Congress stepped up at one point, passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. Income tax, fairer way to fund the system. The government at the time was funded by tariffs. Tariffs played a tremendous role in driving up the cost of everyday items for people, especially in this part of the country, and led to these railroad trusts that were strangling the country as well. So an income tax was a much fairer way at that time to fund the government, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. You had state legislatures step up in places like New York and New Jersey and said things like set minimum wages for women. It was considered a disgrace that unmarried women were living in disgraceful poverty conditions and couldn't earn a living. They also passed minimum hours for health reasons for people working in factories and sweatshop factories. All that the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional. They said any law designed to protect labor was per se unconstitutional. Now, in all these cases that we've talked about, overturning the Civil Rights Act of 1875, declaring the Alabama Constitution to be perfectly legal, allowing Louisiana to force black people and white people to be in separate cars, declaring that the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was going to attack those trusts, that was unconstitutional, declaring that the income tax was unconstitutional, declaring that labor laws were unconstitutional. All of those cases that I mentioned, John Marshall Harlan dissented, and in the majority of them, he was the sole dissenter. Imagine what it meant, the sole dissenter. Everybody in the leadership class and everybody on the Supreme Court was thinking one way. Harlan was thinking a different way. And the dissents that he wrote, which are now famous today, played a major role in getting those laws overturned and in various different ways restoring a sort of judicial balance, a sense of justice and balance in the United States. So that's why I think we should celebrate Harlan today. So the question then that led me to want to do this book was, how did he see things differently? You know, what was the roots of his own perspective and why was it different? And a lot of it comes back to this part of the country, back to Kentucky and the Kentucky story. His family was one of the first families that came out to Kentucky. They had their own fort in Harlan Station. And believed, like many of the leading Kentuckians, that they were sort of creating nirvana here in the bluegrass. They were largely refugees from Virginia. They wanted to create a more egalitarian type culture than Virginia, which was dominated by a few very rich landowners. They also believed in advancing the cause of, education and public welfare in a strong way. And so there was a certain amount of idealism that was built into his perspective. When he was born in 1833, his father was pretty much the leading lawyer in Kentucky already, had a dream of amassing the largest private law library, which at that time was a source of tremendous power. If you knew the laws and the precedents, that would give you tremendous power as a lawyer. He also believed, he had 6 sons, he believed that they should eventually go into a law firm and start a family law firm, and they could have their own clout. By the time John Marshall Harlan came along, he was the 4th son in the family, or 5th, as we'll see, depending on Robert Harlan's situation. His father named him after one of his great heroes, the great Chief Justice, John Marshall. And John Marshall was the man who had asserted the primacy of law over politics. He was the architect of judicial review. He said that the Supreme Court and not Congress gets to say what the Constitution means. And it wasn't an accident that James Harlan so respected John Marshall, because already in 1833, the seeds of sectionalism and sectional conflict were brewing. And it was something that Kentuckians felt pretty much uniquely because of the border status that they were in. people in Kentucky could, look to their south and see the implacable nature of slave owners and the system of enslaving people and how it was becoming more ingrained. But they could also look to their north and the feelings of some of their citizens and see the growing sense of outrage and intolerance over the condition of slavery. The actions of abolitionists to the north, the actions of secessionists in the south were already brewing at that time. I think that James Harlan named John Marshall Harlan after John Marshall because he thought the only solution was essentially a legal solution, that law would supersede politics. Politics would always be problematic in this case. The Harlans were also very close to Henry Clay, who had already engineered the Missouri Compromise at that time and was a leader nationally in trying to find some way to forestall this coming crisis that they imagined. So the Harlans were involved, James Harlan as a close friend of Henry Clay, they were involved in things like the failed colonization program, the idea that enslaved people could be returned to Africa and create their own society in Liberia, which proved to be a failure, but was part of the idea of trying to find a third way, a compromise out of the vice that they felt that they were in. There were also plans to compensate economically the slave owners as sort of a national solution to try to, forestall the tensions that were already rising. And of course, there were geographic solutions to try to balance the political power when it came to admitting territories and states into the Union. And Henry Clay was at the forefront of all of those, and James Harlan was always at his side. And John Marshall, growing up, revered Henry Clay and believed that Henry Clay was a great statesman and saw Henry Clay speak many times, including here in Frankfort. And at various times, James Harlan was occupying statewide jobs. He was also the elected Attorney General as well here, and then later he was the U.S. Attorney here. And at those times, the Harlan family would move to Frankfort, and they would live in town. They also had a summer house that was like up in the mountains, just a few miles away, that they would sort of repair to during the warm weather months. Where John was actually born was over near Danville, which is where Harlan Station was, in the old stone house, which was the Harlan family mansion. And he lived a fairly idyllic childhood, but with a very stern father who believed strongly in discipline and education, particularly for the boys. But there was one boy in the family who was different from the others, older than the others, and also a man of mixed race who was technically enslaved in the family, and literally enslaved in the family, but was also living in the main house and was given unusual privileges and treated more as a member of the family than the other people who were enslaved, which were not field hands, they were house workers, but they lived separately. They didn't live in the main house up in Danville. And Robert Harlan was a figure of much speculation at that time. Now, in later years, he became a very prominent man. So we know now a lot about his background from profiles and things that were in newspapers during his lifetime, and that he could have corrected or would have corrected if there was anything wrong. So we can get a picture of what his life was. And what his life was is that when he was 8 years, that he was born in very southern Virginia, right along the North Carolina border. And he was born into an enslaved woman who was also believed to be of mixed race, and he himself was quite light-skinned and of mixed race. It happened to be a plantation in Mecklenburg County, which is where James Harlan's mother's family was from. We know from these newspaper profiles that he and his mother, when he was 8 years old, made the journey, 400-mile journey from southern Virginia to Kentucky. And it was said that they were making the journey to try to find his father. Now, they came to Harlan Station, which was a family town. So clearly they believed the father was a Harlan man. Only Harlans lived in Harlan Station, and that's where they came. We also know that after this period, at 8 years old, that Robert Harlan came to live with James Harlan, who had just gotten married at the time and was only 24 years old. He would have been 16 when Robert was born. So out of that grew this belief that perhaps as a teenager, James Harlan had been the father of Robert, and that was certainly the persistent view. Even in later years in African-American newspapers and horse racing journals, people would report that and say that. I think it's also possible that James Harlan believed that Robert was the son of his own father who had passed away in those intervening 8 years and believed him to be a relative. But one way or the other, Robert had a very special relationship with James Harlan, who saw potential in him. And it's very interesting when you go back and read the recollections in the family, the other Harlan boys, including John Marshall Harlan, felt their father to be a sort of distant authoritarian figure. They admired him, they revered him, but they didn't seem to have a lot of personal closeness to them. Whereas the surviving letters of Robert Harlan refer to James Harlan in a more sort of affectionate kind of personal kind of way than in the other kids. So the unique status of Robert Harlan really can't be emphasized anymore. I mean, he was in this, this truly unusual position within the family. Now, he also later in life, Robert Harlan, would say that he was educated for a half day in school. That's because James Harlan took him to school to try to enroll him, and when they realized that he was African American, he was kicked out of school after half a day. And this annoyed James Harlan, so he was sort of home taught after that. But it, in one way, sort of freed Robert from the kind of rigid control that James Harlan had over the other boys in the family, where they were studying all night. And Robert was able to develop a quality that was really quite extraordinary when you go back and look at it. And the quality is finding a way for a black person to succeed against the greatest odds. And certainly the greatest odds have to be enslavement, right? But Robert Harlan always was able to find a way, to find an angle. So the first angle was the Kentucky horse racing industry. At that time, it was just getting started. And they used to joke about how the early racing meets looked like a checkerboard because they're about half black people, half white people, because the early horse owners also had enslaved people working with the horses, jockeys and trainers. And I think that Robert Harlan sensed that this was one atmosphere where a black person could develop some real expertise and could make an impact. And he did, you know, from the time he was like 20 years old, he would go off and help to stage races. In those days, there weren't big race courses. So you would go from town to town, set out a race course. You'd also have to, you know, manage the betting and keep the purse, which was literally a leather purse. So if you imagine John Marshall Harlan at age 6, 7, 8, 9, seeing this man renowned for his handsomeness, like 20 years old, coming back on his horse with a pouch full of money. In those days, you had to be a tough guy to be able to run a race and manage a race. Probably had a gun in his holster, and he was coming back, and he was this figure of sort of mystery and interest, intense interest on the part of the Harlan family. So I think there was a relationship there in the sense that Robert Harlan in later years would refer knowingly and confidently to a relationship with John Marshall Harlan, and John Marshall Harlan always expressed a kind of latent respect for Robert Harlan. So there was an unusual dynamic that was set there. For Robert Harlan, the next opportunity came with the gold rush in 1849. You know, gold in them thar hills out in San Francisco. And he sensed again that this was an opportunity where a black person, despite enslavement and other things, could make an impact, because everybody was rushing to San Francisco, including people from Asia, people from Europe, people all around. You know, this was sort of the ultimate kind of Wild West situation. So he hopped on a boat and went down the Mississippi River and was one of the first group of Kentuckians, part of a party of the first group of Kentuckians, to go all the way, take a boat down to New Orleans, go from New Orleans to Panama City, cross all of Panama, which of course meant, you know, crossing through rainforests and mountains and things like that to get to the west coast of Panama, take a rickety boat up to San Francisco. They probably abandoned the boat in San Francisco Harbor because the lumber was worth more than the return engagement and these other things. And what we know is that Robert Harlan came back with a chest full of gold that was worth, in today's dollars, over $6 million. and immediately became the richest man in the Harlan family. And he took that money and moved to Cincinnati, which at the time was a place of great promise for African Americans because it was just over the river. It was the first free city for people, and the black community was already becoming active there, free black community there. And there he did things quite interesting. He invested in a lot of black-owned businesses, something as simple as a grocer. He held the mortgage on a grocery. Something as complicated as a place called Dumas House that was like a club for free black people where they had, velvet tables in the front and people would play poker and faro and other betting games, which is something Robert Harlan was very attracted to. But then later on, when you had the fugitive slave law and the situation for black people in Cincinnati changed dramatically for the worse, they would hide runaways in the basement of the Dumas House, which Robert Harlan owned. He also, in 1851, this is right after he had made money, he decided to give himself a world tour of Europe. In those times, only the very richest Americans would go to Europe and do this sort of grand tour. He gave himself a grand tour and ended up visiting the Crystal Palace exhibit in London, which is a famous exhibit that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had with the giant Crystal Palace showing all of these industrial innovation. It was dedicated to science and technology. And what did he see in the science and technology center? But he saw photographs of Cincinnati, his own hometown, and realized that there were photographic pioneers in his own hometown. So he opened a photo studio, and some of the leading photographers, the photographic pioneers of all time, of all the world, who happened to be African Americans, worked out of Robert Harlan's photo studio during that time. So he was a very enterprising person, became a leader in the Cincinnati community. And then, when the situation did change in the late 1850s, a benchmark moment for both John Marshall Harlan and Robert Harlan was the Dred Scott decision. That was a decision that validated the fugitive slave law and that said that black people had no rights under the Constitution, even free black people. So imagine what that means to somebody like Robert Harlan, who's a man of means, but imagine what it also means to young John Marshall Harlan, who's already building a political career in Kentucky in his early 20s, going town to town, giving speeches on the great issues of the day. And he and his father so believed in the law, so strongly believed in the law, that they felt that the solution to the ever-worsening crisis leading to the Civil War could only be solved through the law. Finally, the Supreme Court takes on the slavery issue in 1857 and comes out with the Dred Scott decision, written by Justice Roger Taney, who was the opposite of John Marshall. He was a Jeffersonian. He was not a Federalist. He was very different. So the Harlans, I think, felt deeply bruised by the Dred Scott decision in many different ways. I think John Marshall Harlan felt that was the moment that he realized those compromises were never going to work. Remember the compromise they all worked on with Henry Clay to try to do that inevitably this was going to lead to war and conflict. And it struck terror in them because they knew that Kentucky was on the border and they felt Kentucky would be the victim of this war. For Robert Harlan, he felt that all of his hard-won gains, even in Cincinnati, were now going to be subject to the whims of essentially these renegade slave catchers trying to bedevil any person, even free black people, and try to return them to the South. So Robert Harlan made the decision to move his family to Europe and did something very enterprising and typically enterprising for him. He realized, because of his trips to Europe in the previous years, that horse racing was something that was had enormous popular appeal in England. It was the sport of kings. It was literally the British royal family dedicated themselves to horse racing. But he believed that Kentucky bred better horses than England did. So he conceived of this idea that he would bring 3 Kentucky-bred horses to England and challenge the Brits on their own turf, create a kind of U.S. versus Britain move. I think he also recognized that the racial situation in England was not nearly as virulent as in the United States. So for he and his family, being in Europe during that time was very valuable. And to make a long story short, he did stage those races. He didn't always succeed, but at a certain point he sort of changed his strategy, sold some of the Kentucky horses, bought some European horses, and continued to be for 10 years a major figure in European racing, but also traveled all around Europe met with, Irish Republicans and things like that, and got a real taste for Europe, spent time in Paris as well. Before, in Robert Harlan's case, returning to Cincinnati after the war to become, once again, the leading black citizen and to take up on a political leadership role within the Republican Party. Meanwhile, John Marshall Harlan had a very different trajectory. He was obsessed with keeping Kentucky loyal to the Union. That was his great cause. He and his father both considered themselves to be conservative Unionists, which is to say they were not abolitionists, but they did believe strongly in the United States and wanting to oppose the rebellion in any possible way. And this was an absolutely perilous time in Kentucky, and you guys probably know as much about it or have heard as much about it, but the Harlans and the Speed brothers, James and Joshua Speed, they were the two most trusted families of the Lincoln administration. And so the Lincoln administration was literally sending guns to the Harlans and the Speeds. In the Harlan's case, they were just lawyers, and the Speeds also were lawyers, basically. But with the idea that if the South tried to invade Kentucky and take the state for the Confederacy, that there would be a Union resistance, an armed Union resistance that would be able to take hold. So suddenly, John Marshall Harlan has to become a man of action. He and the Speed brothers then also took to the streets of Louisville with bullhorns and stood on the street corners, imploring people to be loyal to the U.S. government, and also promising them that if they stayed loyal, that the Lincoln administration would give them the power to determine their future, including on issues like slavery. And that was, in his mind, a very important thing, that Kentucky would have its own right to self-determination if it stayed loyal. Now, the governor of Kentucky at that time, Beriah McGoffin, was loyal to the South. He was a Confederate. The legislature was quite divided. So Harlan lived in perpetual fear that during this period, there would be a legislative deal that would back Governor McGoffin and allow Kentucky to become part of the Confederacy. And this was a source of great concern. So he literally would sleep at night on the floors of the old State House, just a couple blocks from here, and try to be present so that no political deals could be cut in the dead of night. He also secretly wrote editorials for the Courier-Journal in Louisville because the legendary editor at that time was a Confederate sympathizer, but the owner was loyal to the United States, and he implored on the owner to put the editor out for several months for alleged fake illness and let him, John Marshall Harlan, write editorials supporting the United States. Now, as you know, initially he succeeded in keeping Kentucky neutral and then, in a short order, remaining part of the United States. And I think he considered that one of his great accomplishments in life. And there are people out there who say that if Kentucky had been part of the Confederacy, it would have changed the whole dynamics of the war. And so that alone is a tremendous patriotic act to the United States to put your neck out. But then he further put his neck out because he already had a reputation in his 20s of being a great orator and a future leader of Kentucky. He put his personal prestige on the line to recruit a regiment to fight in the Civil War. And he recruited 800 people to join him in fighting for the Union. And he put his own life on the line, leading them into battle throughout the South. But he also spoke very mournfully of seeing friends and colleagues on the other side. So, he would talk about it at Shiloh, walking over corpses of people that he knew, and understanding then the depths of the tragedy of the Civil War, the shock of the Civil War during that time. He fought for 2 years, ultimately left the military in 1863 because of a terrible family crisis, which was the death of his father. His father had developed pneumonia on a carriage ride between Louisville and Frankfort that sort of occurred in the fog of war. There were raiders and things like that, so you could only travel late at night, and he tried to travel late at night, and there was an unusual chill that night, and he had not been prepared for it. And when he arrived back home, he was immediately put to bed and ill. and died at age 63 of an infectious disease. And in those pre-penicillin days, what would happen is people's throats would immediately constrict and they would pass away. So it was a shock that his father, who had been a robust leader and was at that time the U.S. attorney for the Lincoln administration here in Kentucky, that his father would pass away. Even worse, his father left behind a lot of debts because while he was in public office, he did have some private clients, but they weren't able to make a lot of money. And you had, in those days, these enormous extended family obligations. Anytime a relative had some financial need, they had to come and get money. So he had to give up the war so that he could go and help his mother and family make money. He also, during this time, indemnified his mother and took over his mother's finances, which technically made him a slave owner. So today when people say John Marshall Harlan, they have to say, well, he was an imperfect man because he was indeed a slave owner. But at that time, one should consider that the enslaved people in the house, including his own nursemaid, who he was very close to, would have suffered greatly if the mother's finances were taken over by debt collectors. They would have been sold in the last months to year of the war, probably down to Louisiana, and would have suffered greatly. So he may have had a benevolent interest in taking over the ownership of the enslaved people in his family. After the war, he continued to be a political leader and was elected Attorney General and took up residence in Frankfort and took over that job in Frankfort. But it became a very difficult chapter for him because the Lincoln administration and then the Andrew Johnson administration after that put Kentucky under martial law. As again, most of you know, it was a pretty brutal time, and there are conflicting interpretations of it. By many accounts, it was brutal to the citizens of Kentucky, and people felt very as though their rights had been taken away. White people felt their rights had been taken away. There are other ways of looking at it that the Lincoln administration and later the Johnson administration were actually helping to protect the freedom of black people because the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Kentucky. But some of the generals who were in charge here would arrange for free passes for enslaved people to go across the river and find their freedom over in other states and other places. So it was a mixed period. But as a matter of law and as a man of law, John Marshall Harlan felt personally implicated in this decision to put his state under martial law. Remember, he was the one with bullhorns out there in the streets of Louisville telling everybody that the Lincoln administration would treat Kentucky kindly if Kentucky stayed loyal. So he felt it to be a federal betrayal of Kentucky in a strong way. He also felt that as the leading elected legal officer, that it was his job to fight this. So that shaped his immediate post-war feelings. He was very disaffected with the federal government, continued to take a sort of moderate stance on politics, ran for governor on a sort of conservative unionist position. At that time, even some of the conservative, on a conservative unionist sort of moderate position. And then in the late 1860s, had a radical change in politics that was caused by the Ku Klux Klan. Early Ku Klux Klan marauders began taking power into their own hands in Kentucky. There were various other groups in addition to the Klan that later became part of the Klan, but that would really control whole towns in Kentucky and commit lynchings and other illegal acts. And Harlan and his friend Ben Bristow were very determined to fight this, saw this as bitter lawlessness. And it caused Harlan's politics to shift dramatically from being essentially a centrist to being what would then be called a radical Republican. He came to believe that equality needed to be enforced, the rights of black people needed to be enforced, lawlessness needed to be punished, and started preaching that way. Now, the fact that he had different politics at other periods immediately made him a figure of some distrust. And he gave a famous speech in Lawrence, Kentucky, but repeated it in several other places, where he said he'd rather be right than consistent, and talked about all the things that had happened and how he had prayed and hoped for a solution to the slavery problem. But now that it was gone, he rejoiced. He said he rejoiced that the great sun of liberty now shines on all Americans, and called slavery the greatest despotism that ever existed. He took a very strong stance in that way. Now, in 1876, there was a disputed presidential election, as you know, between Rutherford Hayes in Ohio and Samuel Tilden, the Democratic nominee from New York. And Harlan had been very active in that campaign, and Robert Harlan had also been active in that campaign, because the Republican convention that year was in Cincinnati, and John Marshall Harlan was not only a delegate, but he was the leader of the Bristow forces. At the time, his friend Ben Bristow, who had been a cabinet member in the Grant administration, was leading candidate for president. He was known as a reformer. He had cracked down on Republican corruption and excess during the Grant years. And a lot of people felt the only way the Republicans would possibly win was to elect somebody who was totally distanced from the Grant administration. And Harlan made a passionate case for Bristow. At that time, by tradition, the candidates did not come themselves to the convention. There was a lot of communication between John Marshall Harlan and Robert Harlan, who was living there in Cincinnati, to try to advocate for Bristow. Robert Harlan told John, while he was willing to help, make buttons and things like that for Bristow, that he felt obliged to support Rutherford B. Hayes, the former governor of Ohio, who was sort of the favorite son candidate of Ohio, but then assured John that after the first ballot, when Hayes would become nothing but a favorite son, he would then shift his support to Bristow. In fact, the opposite happened. It was Hayes who started gaining support and Bristow who started losing support. And at a key moment, John Harlan, who had given a memorable convention speech then, made the decision to release the Bristow forces, to have them join the Hayes forces. It carried the day for Hayes, and it created a political debt that Hayes felt towards John Marshall Harlan. Part of the dispute in 1876 was settled through sort of backroom, smoke-filled room dealings in which the Republicans made a series of concessions to Democrats to try to smooth the way for Hayes to become president. One of those concessions was appointing a Southerner to the Supreme Court. David Davis, who'd been a friend of Abraham Lincoln's, had been on the Supreme Court, and then was offered a senator's position and a chance to leave the court. So there was an opening on the court, and that was a pretty explicit deal that Hayes would agree to put a Southerner. So Hayes takes the presidency, and the Judiciary Committee is still under the control of Republicans who were civil rights advocates, the so-called radical Republicans in the Judiciary Committee. So he has made this agreement to appoint a Southerner, but he also needs somebody who's acceptable to a civil rights-oriented Republican Party. And that limited the choices quite severely because, first of all, the Republicans didn't have a lot of supporters in the South. And second of all, the people that they did have in the South were imperfect candidates in a lot of ways, as was John Marshall Harlan, for that matter. He had a reputation for brilliance. He had a reputation for caring about the law. He was considered a fine statesman in many ways, but he had shifted in politics. He was not an abolitionist. He was a centrist, et cetera, et cetera. Now, people might say it was very easy for Northerners to make that bar because they could be abolitionists without ever sacrificing anything. It was sort of the dominant position in Massachusetts and New York. And a lot of them also hired people to take their place in the Union Army and things. But that was considered sufficient to get over the bar of being a civil rights supporter. Harlan, despite these passionate speeches in Lawrence and elsewhere, was held in suspicion, deep suspicion, including by George Edmunds, the Vermont senator who was the head of the Judiciary Committee and wanted to block the nomination, seriously. Now, Robert Harlan, at that time, had attained a position of power in Ohio. Ohio was a pivotal state. It was Hayes's own state. And the black vote was what separated the Democrats and Republicans, and Robert Harlan controlled a large portion of the black vote. So he was making regular trips to Washington and was close to all of the black leaders at that time in Washington. And there were a series of moves that he did designed to preserve and promote John Marshall Harlan's candidacy for the Supreme Court. One was he not covered up, but he sort of covered within the black community for John Harlan when a cousin of John Harlan's on his mother's side got into a dispute with a black leader and shot him. And it was thought to be racially motivated. It may or may not have been racially motivated, but Robert Harlan brokered a deal that essentially promoted justice while preserving the Harlan family name. He also openly lobbied for Harlan and sent letters back to John Marshall Harlan for the Supreme Court from talking to officials. And we don't know how much impact Robert Harlan's advocacy had, but if you were a member of that Judiciary Committee and you were doubting whether John Marshall Harlan was a true supporter of civil rights, and here you have Robert Harlan, who at the time was known as the second to Frederick Douglass as leaders of the black community, saying, I grew up in the same home as this man, I know him, you can trust him. I think it made a significant difference. And they ultimately cut a deal where Edmunds himself left the room. The Judiciary Committee voted to advance the nomination, and Harlan was confirmed. Now, for 5 years on the Supreme Court, Harlan was largely a sort of go-along, get-along justice. The Chief Justice at the time, Morrison Waite, believed in consensus, and he was part of a lot of 9-0 decisions during that time. He was also acutely aware that he was much younger than his colleagues, and of course he was the only Southerner, as people know. They were all senior Northerners. Then came the civil rights cases of 1883. Now, you remember I had referred before to the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was actually something that Robert Harlan himself politically had played a large role in getting the Grant administration to push through. But it was challenged because people in various states in the North and the South and elsewhere would violate that law. So among the plaintiffs in this case were black people who sought to go to the New York Opera House and were rejected by ticket takers there. It was people there was a half Native American, half African American person in Kansas who was told to leave a table in a restaurant to allow a white person to take their seat. There was an elected representative in Jefferson City who was denied access to a hotel. There was a wealthy woman who bought a first-class rail ticket and was denied access to the first-class rail car. So all these cases were combined into one epic civil rights case in 1883. And it was certainly a big moment for the Supreme Court. It was one of those moments when the entire country was watching the court. There were literally stage productions in Atlanta that were interrupted with news reports about what was happening as this case was being argued. And it was considered very important for the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Waite to have a unanimous opinion. But Harlan was deeply bothered by this case. He had fought in the Civil War. He had experienced the sense of what happens when there's inequality under the law, which is what he saw as the root cause of the Civil War. He had rejoiced ultimately at the end of slavery. He had thought that the protections that were granted in the post-Civil War amendments were explicitly designed by original intent and originalism to bring black people up to a position of equality. The plain language, equal protection, is there. There is even language in the Constitution saying that people can legislate to promote these amendments and things. So he felt that what his colleagues were doing in trying to oppose the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was deeply wrong. Now, it was not a totally implausible legal argument, but it was a very constrained one that the majority came up with. They said essentially the Constitution was a restriction on state action, and so all of these private acts like booting somebody out of a restaurant, not allowing them on a train, et cetera, that unless it was the state doing it, unless you could trace it to the state, the federal government did not have the power to reach those things. Now, Harlan knew that in the debates over the Civil Rights Act of 1875, it was explicitly described that they needed to pass an amendment that would secure the constitutionality of a predecessor Civil Rights Act in 1866. framers of the amendments were still alive during that time and said that explicitly they wanted to give the federal government this power. But the Supreme Court came up with what they felt was a very consistent argument. So Harlan was under tremendous pressure as the youngest justice to go along. And his wife actually wrote about this. His wife, Malvina Harlan, said that he would sit in his study on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., and agonize over this opinion and agonize over it. And she realized that he was in crisis. They were both actually in crisis because their eldest daughter, the eldest of their 6 children, had died shortly after giving birth, died of typhoid fever, and they were both in grief, and they would ultimately leave that house because there were too many ghosts in that house. And he was a man sort of tormented. He also finally developed this feeling. He had said in a letter to his 3 sons who were at college when their sister died, he said, every day of his life, he would try to live up to their sister's legacy. He believed she was the finest, most public-spirited person in the world, and that he could only admire her and that she was going to be his lodestar. And one of the things that she had done was teach the children of freed slaves to learn English and advance them at a predecessor to the Metropolitan AME Church in Washington. And I think with all of that going on in his head, thinking about the legacy of time in, his time in Kentucky during the run-up to the Civil War, thinking about what he had seen from Robert Harlan, how Robert Harlan became a rich, successful man, even when his rights were in a rudimentary way. When he thinks of his daughter Edith and her belief in sort of educating people, he decided to break with his colleagues in a very forceful way. Now, his dissent in the civil rights cases of 1883 had certain similarities to his dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson, which became his most famous act. But he also constructed an entirely different legal approach to interpreting the 14th Amendment that looks in many ways like our current approach to the 14th Amendment. He also talked about the U.S. Commerce Clause, which allows Congress to regulate interstate commerce, and how under that Commerce Clause they could enforce civil rights as an interstate matter. And in 1965, the Supreme Court ultimately approved a Civil Rights Act under the Commerce Clause using a legal strategy that Harlan outlined in his dissent. After 1883, Harlan really did become known as the Great Dissenter, and he was lionized by some people and detracted by others. Frederick Douglass, after the cases of 1883, declared that Harlan's dissenting opinion was the greatest opinion ever written in the history of the Supreme Court. He wrote Harlan a letter saying that, like leaves in the fall, it should be spread throughout the country to fertilize the country and to fertilize the minds. He saw it as Harlan's dissent as the one great moment and the one great thing. One thing that we now have, because African-American newspapers are now digitized and you can look them up, is you realize just how intently the black community was watching all of these cases. And so Harlan went on to become a firm dissenter when the Supreme Court sought to take away the rights of black people, dissenting in the voting rights case involving Alabama, dissenting in a case involving Berea College here in Kentucky. Pretty brutal case. Berea College had been founded before the Civil War to treat African Americans and white people equally under the same umbrella. And everybody who went to that college knew what they were getting into. They were making a choice. It was an entirely private institution. Here in Frankfort, the legislature, under the thrall of segregation, tried to declare that it was a crime for black people and white people to be educated together in any possible way. Berea brought the case to Kentucky. Kentucky legal authorities sided with segregation. The case went on to the U.S. Supreme Court. And at that time, the majority, I think they were all thinking they needed to do something to tamp down prejudice. That there was an economic boom in the North. They didn't want to create any more disruption and things like that. And they found a very tortured way to approve the Kentucky law. And Harlan wrote another passionate dissent, talking about education and the transfer of knowledge as sort of a God-given right that needs to be supported, and outraged and angered dissent. And then ultimately came the Louisiana Carr Act decision, Plessy v. Ferguson. By then, Harlan had been in the minority on all these cases in race, but he recognized immediately that this one was of even greater significance because it was going to put the legal imprimatur of the Constitution behind the whole policy of segregation. It was a very little-known case at the time. It was a strange case. It wasn't even brought by the national black leadership. Black leaders like Frederick Douglass and Robert Harlan were not in favor of even bringing the Plessy v. Ferguson case. It was brought by Creoles in Louisiana, whose primary anger was that they had been leading citizens of Louisiana, and they were now defined by this law as being black when they were people of mixed race who had long been respected citizens. And they felt like something was being taken away from them. That stance alone did not engender great sympathy within the black community in a lot of ways. But from a legal point of view, this was a watershed. It, unlike the civil rights case of 1883, got almost no news. It wasn't even front page news in New Orleans. It was that obscure case. But Harlan wrote a magisterial dissent that is now quoted widely throughout the country and throughout the world, and is considered the definitive statement on equal protection in the United States. First of all, he understood the significance of the case far greater than anyone in the majority or anyone else in the commentariat. He said, one day this case will be as infamous as Dred Scott. Now, that was a laughable overstatement at that time, but today, literally, if you go to talk to Supreme Court scholars across the spectrum, ask them what were the two worst decisions in Supreme Court history. They'd say, oh, Dred Scott and Plessy. He was exactly right in saying that. But he also believed that it was so fundamentally unfair to black people that he wrote passionately about the sense of injustice done to black people, and explicitly used the term injustice. He also saw the case in terms of damage to the United States, because keep in mind, he believed strongly that his diagnosis of the problem of the Civil War from his unique vantage point here in Kentucky was that inequality under the law is always going to lead to disputes. He advanced this also, by the way, separately during the same era when the United States began taking over Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and other places in the so-called insular cases. He took the stance that the Constitution has to follow the flag. You can't have some cobbled together legal regimen for these non-white colonies all around the world while having a totally different constitutional system for the continental United States. But a lot of that passion got infused into his Plessy dissent. And it's a dissent that contains some very strong and memorable lines. The Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. There is no caste here. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. These are strong notions that go beyond just the letter of the law, which he felt was being violated, beyond the original intent of the law, which he felt was being violated, beyond sort of the basic concept of fairness to black people, which he felt was being violated, but went to sort of the foundational principles of the United States. And it's very, very rare when you see a legal opinion that it goes that deep into the foundation, that what he's saying is that this case is a stain on all of us as Americans. It is something that is going to bedevil white people and black people for hundreds of years if we don't overturn it. And it was so powerfully stated that it immediately attracted attention, even in this little obscure case. So that's another benefit of us knowing. When African Americans saw that dissent, his dissent in Plessy became their lodestar. So when Harlan died in 1911, there were spontaneous memorial services in cities all across the country led by black people, and no white people visibly attended. In Washington, D.C., there were 3 such immediate cases. There were announcements of memorial services where people would come together, and the grief was very palpable. There were a very emotional sense, like, who is ever going to advocate for us now that Harlan is gone, and may God welcome this righteous man into the kingdom of heaven, those kinds of statements. 2 weeks later, they had a collective meeting that attracted more than 1,000 people, all black, at the Metropolitan AME, which is where Harlan's daughter had taught. And they read aloud from these dissents in the race cases. Now, if you can imagine being a young African-American aspiring lawyer or somebody at that time, there was a powerful sense of ownership of these views of Harlan's and the sense of inspiration. Now, Thurgood Marshall was born 2 years later, 1913, but he also was schooled in the Harlan dissents and became a lifelong admirer, a fervent admirer of Harlan's. Constance Baker Motley, who was sort of his number 2 in the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, wrote that every time they wrote a brief to attack segregation, they included lines from Harlan's Plessy dissent. She recalled that they would sit at a circular table, the lawyers strategizing, and that Thurgood Marshall would stand up and he'd start reading aloud. The Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates class among citizens. They wrote that in Brown versus Board of Education. The NAACP brief was built around, in many ways, Harlan's views, and explicitly said that Justice Harlan understood better than the court's majority the real meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. When Brown versus Board of Education was finally passed unanimously, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson in 1954, the headline on the New York Times editorial page the next day was Justice Harlan concurring. And they said it was that rarest instance where the one voice in the wilderness braying at the moon was finally, after a period of 60 years, listened to and followed and ultimately obeyed. So when we think about John Marshall Harlan, not only should we think about his extraordinary life and the extraordinary contributions of Robert Harlan and all of the American history that's sort of wrapped up in their stories, but we should also think about what if Harlan hadn't existed? What if all of those decisions that took away black people's rights were unanimous decisions by the white community? I believe, and Thurgood Marshall has said, that Harlan's dissents gave him the confidence to challenge segregation at crucial moments in the 20th century when he had to go from town to town and persuade people to be plaintiffs in these cases that would challenge their kids being kicked out of school or rejected from all-white institutions, knowing that the Ku Klux Klan was there to try to enforce segregation. For those people, those black plaintiffs that had to fight segregation, they knew they were putting their lives on the line. And Marshall had to persuade them that at least some white people would be capable of seeing things through black people's eyes. And Harlan was his prime example for that. So I would say at one of the darkest moments in Supreme Court history and a time with great resonance throughout American history, including into the current day, Harlan was a unique beacon of light. And he was a source of hope, not just for all black people, but for a lot of white people who dreamed of a fairer America. And that's why today people remember him so fondly and so powerfully. That's why they still quote all of those sort of magical lines from his Plessy v. Ferguson dissent. And it's why people here in Kentucky and elsewhere want to honor him and accept him as a great American hero that I believe he was. So thank you very much for having me. And I would love to answer any questions.
Oh, there we go. All right. There you go, Judge.
I've always been curious, has Robert Harlan's deed of manumission been preserved, and was it filed originally in the Franklin County Courthouse?
Has his original what been preserved?
Deed of manumission, when he was free.
Oh, yes. He was freed just before he went to go to the gold rush, but he insisted on paying for his own freedom. And by then he had been working not just through his horse racing winnings, but he'd been working running a barber shop in Harrodsburg when he was younger. So he was somewhat financially independent. And even though we know that he spoke well of James Harlan later in life, and he even named his son Robert James. His son, he had a son that was, the focus of his dreams and his ambitions, and he was, for much of his life, he was a single dad because his wives kept dying on him. He honored James Harlan by giving the middle name to the middle name of James to his son. So I think the interpretation is that he wanted to pay for his freedom for reasons of pride, not because James was trying to drive a tough deal. But you never know. I mean, at many times the Harlan family was in trouble for money, all of them except for Robert. And there were times when Robert actually helped them out. There's an aspect in this sort of biographical sketch that John Harlan's wife, Malvina, wrote after his death, where she described a wedding of the Harlan sister Elizabeth in Indiana, where the finest gift was a handmade piano for the music-loving Elizabeth from Robert. And one of my great frustrations is that after John Harlan goes on the Supreme Court, we don't have records of letters between Robert and John, and you can only speculate about their relationship. And you would wonder, could it be that there was some estrangement or some sort of problem, especially since Robert Harlan Jr. was living in Washington and Robert Sr. was traveling to Washington all the time. I don't think there was, because for one thing, why would Malvina Harlan proclaim her, affection for Robert Harlan if they were estranged and not close? I mean, she was the ultimate loyal wife. So if she felt that her husband would not have felt positively towards Robert, she wouldn't have done that. I think that what happened is once Harlan went on the Supreme Court, he was so overwhelmed with work that in those days, justices never retired, somewhat like today, but they would, because there were no pensions for them. So the tradition then was that you would become totally disabled as a justice, not be able to do your work, but you would refuse to quit until Congress granted you a special pension. So at any given time on the court, there were several dysfunctional justices, and they then would divide up all the majority opinions among the remaining justices. But then Harlan wrote so many dissents that he was always writing an additional trove of cases and putting a lot of his energy into these dissents, which were purely on his own time. So I think that he just didn't write a lot of letters, is the bottom line, during that time.
I go to Center College in Danville, and I'm even a member of Beta Theta Pi, which was his fraternity, John Marshall Harlan's. And I just wonder if you learned anything about how maybe his time at Center, or even like his relationships with the fraternity, like helped shaped his future and his career.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you were there. I had a chance. Center, erected a statue in Harlan's memory, and I spoke at a Beta reunion that same day. And yes, Harlan, I think the values of Center College for many years were John Marshall Harlan's values. I think also that the sort of fusion between Presbyterian godly theology and the much more secular sort of world of politics and debate was very central to Center's mission during that time. And the president of Center, Feed, was also his childhood minister, who I think influenced him a great deal. He was very proud to be a Beta. I think he was a Beta 10, is that right? He was the 10th member of the fraternity. And one of the wonderful things about the Betas that I've learned is that, people feel this sense of brotherhood even today. So if you probably have a number right, being a Beta, you are still connected to John Marshall Harlan. And not only that, but the Betas became a key source of preserving Harlan's memory during a time when he really wasn't recognized that much. So I've been to the Beta House at Center, where they have on the walls a portrait of Harlan as a Civil War officer and a portrait of Harlan as a Supreme Court justice. And they regularly pay tribute to him as one of the the greats and one of the inspirations for today's beta. So I think that you look at the fraternity and the national fraternity and say that, this was his sort of social home at Center. Center's own expressed values for a long time were his values. Even when he veered in a direction that might have been seen as a little bit different from some people at Center, it was in the spirit of like public debate and civic justice and, thinking in terms of the future of the country that I think was very much taught and encouraged at Center during the time that he was a student there. And he always revered Center and went back for reunions and things like that. He did at Transy as well. He was a graduate of Transylvania Law School as well. And
Yeah, I was going to ask was there anyone in particular at Transylvania in his legal experience there who had an influence on shaping his views? I know Henry Clay, it would have been too late for Henry Clay, but were there others who bore some force in his life?
Well, there's a professor, Robertson, at Transylvania that was a very strong influence for him as a legal scholar and as a legal thinker. A lot of it was, at that time, related to laws of slavery and, the coming Civil War and various things. So at that time, his sort of constitutional unionist views were seen to be influenced by Robertson at Transylvania. I think that in later years, did Vincent also go to Transylvania and see the other? There were several justices who had Kentucky roots at both Center and Transylvania. But he attended Transy reunions as well. When he came back to attend reunions at Transylvania, he also insisted on meeting with groups of black lawyers who were excluded at that time from the reunions as a show of his support for civil rights. But he maintained a deep affection for Kentucky, even while recognizing that during his time on the court, Kentuckians generally did not support his decisions. It was an interesting thing. So when he died, the Courier-Journal wrote a very laudatory editorial talking about what a great statesman he was and that he brought pride to Kentucky and that he was a prominent Kentuckian on the national stage for many, many, many decades and all that. But then said something like, as to the actual merits of his views, we will leave that to others to decide, which was sort of a signal that, there was not a lot of support for Harlan's positions in Kentucky. He, I think, recognized that as well. The state of Kentucky honored him. It happened that his junior law partner, Gus Wilson, became governor of Kentucky at one point and wanted to honor Harlan, who was getting on in years. So they had a banquet at the Plaza Hotel in New York that the state of Kentucky sponsored to honor Harlan. And there was much affection for Kentucky, obviously, that was expressed during that time. But he had something in his speech that probably was aimed at some of those critics within Kentucky, where he was saying, Kentucky is a great state and it's a great part of the United States, but it would be nothing if it weren't part of the larger United States and the larger Constitution and all of that. And he was defending his views of a strong central federal government and the need for sort of common values over regional and sectional concerns, and he was even working it into his speeches when Kentucky was honoring him. So I think he recognized that rub. I think that he and his family in the early days were very much a part of the sort of leading Kentuckians' belief that they were creating this nirvana in the bluegrass. He was proud of Kentucky. He believed Kentucky had the best education system in the West. He pointed to civic improvements. He felt that sense of civic values. One sign that his views on slavery had changed was when he went up to Indiana, where his wife was from, and noted that there was no slavery in Indiana. He was dismayed to see that there was sort of industrial progress being made in southern Indiana that was not being made in Kentucky. And so he started to incorporate into his speeches that, being without slavery has its benefits, that, a free economy may actually turn out to be better for Kentucky, and talked about that. When, as I was saying before, I think that, all of his views on race and all of his views on equality, and he really is the father of equal protection, came about because of those years just before the Civil War, when he just believed strongly that the failure to ensure equality under the law, which he saw as a central premise of the United States, that it had been violated, that almost magically created all of the peculiar interests on slavery sides, that once there's inequality under the law, all these kinds of institutions evolve around it, and it becomes impossible to change. And that was his fear about segregation. It was also his fear about, as I said in the insular cases, the idea that people in American colonies would have different rights, that he felt that, economically people would take advantage of it, and then you couldn't dislodge them once they had an economic interest in it, it would become essentially just like the America that he saw as a very young man just before the Civil War. So he felt like in his dissents that he was warning America against repeating the same mistakes that had been made early in its history, and that he really saw as jeopardizing the American experiment. I mean, he was a true believer in American exceptionalism, and not just named for John Marshall, but he was a reverential believer in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. He frequently talked about how America was the great hope for all of mankind, and how all the other countries of the world were under some form of despotism. It even, when John was saying he's an imperfect man, I was thinking I would forgive him the slave ownership, because I think he was trying to protect the elderly slaves that his mother had. But I would fault him for an early period when he was part of the Know Nothing Party. Because the conservative unionists had no home. He joined the Know Nothing Party. And in later life, he even sent a letter to his sons blaming his father, who was otherwise like a deep inspiration to him and was a sort of sainted figure in his mind. He blamed his father for pushing him into the Know Nothing Party and saying he greatly regretted it. But the one connection he had to it was that he worried that people who came from despotic regimes wouldn't know how to function in a democratic society, that they would have authoritarian tendencies. And he worried at various points that Catholics in positions of power might be beholden to the Pope as a source of authority. Now, he changed his views very early, because in that regiment that he pulled together with the 800 men, it included some Catholic priests. And he wrote very quickly to say the Catholic priests were great patriotic Americans and fought hard and were loyal and protected the men in every way. And it was a strong signal that his views had changed at that point. But if you talk about his imperfection, one of his imperfections was, I think he stayed too long with that view that if you came from another country and grew up under a British king or a pope or an emperor in China or whatever, that you couldn't be a perfect American.
Anyone else have a question or a comment?
It was inspired by Lincoln.
Is what? Sorry.
How did he feel about Lincoln?
Oh,
Was he
interesting.
inspired
He,
by
first of all, in retrospect, you can look and see he and Lincoln shared a lot in common in that they both were admirers of Henry Clay. They both started as conservative unionists, and they both, at different points, but in very, very powerful ways, became advocates for equality, and sort of equality as a sort of foundational principle in America. The putting Kentucky under martial law, I think, soured him greatly on Lincoln. So he actually supported McClellan in 1864 against Lincoln. So his record there, I think, was just very, very influenced by what he saw as the federal government's treatment of Kentucky. But he also saw as like the way he had put his own honor and credibility, and he saw things very much in terms of personal honor. When he assured all of his friends and neighbors that if they stayed loyal to the United States would stay loyal to them, and it just didn't happen in his mind, and he blamed Lincoln for that. So he had a sort of, we have to put down the rebellion and let's reserve the slavery question for later. Now, if you're very charitable towards his views, you could say, I think he did envision some sort of a plebiscite where Kentucky would make a decision to give up slavery. And I think he probably felt that that would be a more durable way of, creating emancipation in Kentucky than having it forced down their people's throats through the federal government or through, giving passes to enslaved people to go to other states and things like that. I think he was envisioning some larger reckoning within Kentucky over slavery. But, you know, during that period, I think that his views were very, very distorted by the abuses that he felt under martial law. And for somebody else who's such a man of the law and a believer in freedom, the idea that people's freedoms would be curtailed so easily just because the President of the United States declares martial law, that was a problematic thing in his mind. So I think that, you know, maybe, yes, I did feel better about Lincoln later, and I think that, you know, you can certainly see the parallels in their lives today. And you know, if we had, if we had them both here today, they would probably say they agreed on 99% of everything. But they might still be arguing about the state of Kentucky in the Civil War.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you. I just want to make a couple quick announcements. If you remember, we were supposed to have Dr. Charlene Fletcher here twice this past winter, and it snowed both times. So unless it snows next weekend, she will be here on Saturday, June 20th at 1 p.m. The title of her presentation is Home Ain't Always Where the Heart Is, Black Women and Confinement in the Gilded Age Bluegrass. Dr. Fletcher comes to us from Butler University, and she will be highlighting the experiences of Black women in the Frankfort Penitentiary during the turn of the 20th century. So we hope that you'll come back and see us then. And then we're taking a little break in July, so there is no lecture in July, even though the newsletter might say it is. Don't ask me about that. It was my fault. But then we'll be back together in August on our regular Saturday, second Saturday, which is August 8th at 1 p.m. with that fine gentleman back on the back row, Dr. Jim Tidwell. He'll be talking about Cove Spring, where history meets nature. So we'll look forward to that as well. And by that time, we'll have our full schedule for the remainder of the year. So just keep your ear to the ground, and we hope to see you next weekend. Thank you so much.
I'll also be at the back table too, if you all
Yes,
want to talk
please,
about
yes,
it.
please come
Any
sign a
other
book.
questions or
Have a book signed.